Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. You are attending the Lakeshore East Corridor Study Community Workshop. And together we'll be looking at various urban design and policy directions to manage compatible growth along Lakeshore Corridor East. Just a reminder, if you could remain on mute, you will have an opportunity to speak later in the program. My name is Ruth Marland. I'm the Manager of Community Relations and I'll be your facilitator for tonight. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that today we gather virtually on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wyandot, and Huron people. We also acknowledge the many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and other global Indigenous peoples who call Mississauga home. We welcome everyone. At this point, I'd like to start the meeting by introducing our Ward 1 Councillor, Councillor Stephen Dasco, for some opening remarks. Over to you, Councillor Dasco.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, and welcome everyone. This is important stuff that we're here for. For me, I look at this as a truly a once in a generation opportunity, and I do say opportunity because there's a lot at stake here. We're looking at Lakeshore, the corridor from Seneca all the way out to the Toronto border. And you know what I have seen and continue to see is I would say we have a relatively tight and new official plan and local area plan that took a lot of hard work and energy to be put in, where we want to have a livable community, walkable, with sky views. And for me, I look at it as what in my heart of hearts, what I love to have is from one end, from essentially the west end of Port Credit right through Lakeview to the Toronto border is this contiguous ribbon that you can walk along and have a walkable, bikeable, movable, multimodal experience where it's got truly that livable community feel. But what we've seen lately, quite frankly, under some of the changes due to items like Bill 108 and 139, we've got folks looking to do more ambitious projects, and I say anybody can do what they like, but for me, I feel like we've got a good plan in place. That's my particular bent on things. But tonight I want to hear from you to see what you would like to see. And so tonight, as we had mentioned, you'll see a presentation, which is going to be some 3D modeling that you can make some comments on. There'll be some breakout rooms, which they'll get into shortly. Also, we are going to have a gentleman by the name of Harold Madi, who's going to give us a presentation, and he will enlighten us about some talking points that we'll be able to get into during our working group. So I don't want to take up a lot of time because, as I mentioned, tonight is about you, and I want to have as much time as possible dedicated to hearing what your input is. And so, thanks again. I'll chime in at the end and also participate and listen to what's going on in our working group. So, thank you all for coming, and I look forward to the night ahead.
Thank you, Councillor Dasco. So this project involves many staff at the city, and at this point I'd like to introduce those staff that are working on this project and guiding it. So we'll start with Karen Kraus. She is the manager of planning programs, so she just waved to everybody. Robert Ruggiero is the project lead and planner leading the project. Robert, you can give a wave. And in the breakout rooms, you will meet our urban designers, Ayman Yaoul and Benez Jaboudari. And we have also two facilitators to guide the conversation with you, Rojan Mohammadi and Anna Malikian. And tonight, our meeting producer is Jasmine Chandy. She'll be at the wheel guiding us through the WebEx journey here. And as Councillor Dasco mentioned, we do have a guest, Harold Madi, who is the founding principal of Urbanism by Design and member of the City of Mississauga's Urban Design Advisory Panel. So I know you'll look forward to hearing from him. So Jasmine, if you could please share the agenda slide, we'll give you a quick review of what the night holds. So just while that's coming up, oh, here we are. Okay, so this is a quick overview. You're going to see a presentation from Harold on best practices and Main Street transformation. Then we'll get into the 3D modeling exercise, which will be done in 2 breakout rooms. Robert Ruggiero will also be giving introductory comments about where we are in the study scope, and then guide our conversation and set up the modeling exercise before we get into the breakout rooms. So that's the agenda slide. And basically in the breakout room, the urban designers will take you through some different modeling, and it's really your opportunity to tell us what works best. And we then look forward to hearing from each group. So we would ask that there be a representative in each group from the community to report back to everybody at the end, so we all have a good idea of the conversation. So we're going to do all this in 110 minutes, so we look forward to hearing from you. And we started these 3 community workshops with a shorter timeline, an hour and a half, and we realized after the first one we had to expand it. So with your indulgence, we have expanded tonight's meeting another half an hour. So that's to enable a bigger, broader conversation in the breakout room. So we do thank you ahead of time for indulging us. Jasmine, if you don't mind, the next slide. We're also happy to let you know that closed captioning is an option, and you'll see the icon for closed captioning in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. So on an individual basis, if you would like to activate that, that is available. Next slide, please. And if you'd like to chat with us during the presentations, we're happy to take any comments or questions that you may have. And if there are questions that can be answered right away, Karen Kraus, the manager, will respond to you in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll try to get to your questions in the breakout room or in the plenary later on in the evening. So chat box is one avenue to chat with us. You may also, in the plenary, raise your hand. And so if you're on the computer or have a mobile phone, to the right of your name, you will see a raise hand icon that you can activate, and I can then acknowledge you to speak your question. And if you did call in, you're not on a computer, you're on your phone. If you press *3, that will raise your hand, and you would press *6 to unmute yourself. So that's a quick WebEx orientation. Next slide, Jasmine, please. Thank you. So just on your screen, this shows you where everything is. Bottom left hand for closed captioning, mute and unmute in the middle of the taskbar, and chat in the bottom right, and raise hand under the participants list to the right of your name. Thanks so much, Jasmine. And you may like to activate the stacked view that enables all the images of everyone participating tonight, which we had quite a number register, as a bar across the top, and whoever is speaking would be in the primary view portion of your screen, or if there's a presentation, that would take up the primary real estate. Next slide, Jasmine. And we know we have many of you participating tonight, and we're so grateful for that. So we do look forward to hearing from you. So we trust that you'll be actively participating and being very respectful, acknowledging that there are many voices that we would like to hear from. So we value your cooperation on that front. Thank you. And we thought we'd do a quick poll because this is helpful to the presenters to know who's in the room, and also if you attended the last February meeting. Jasmine has put up a poll on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you could just take a minute, please, and indicate whether you're a Lakeview resident, a Mississauga resident, Lakeview business owner, agency or region staff, land developer or consultant, or if you fit the other category. And secondly, were you with us on February 23rd? That would be helpful to know. And in a moment, Jasmine will share the results so we all will know who's in the room. So it looks like we've got a good representation from residents and a good balance through the other categories. And some of you, maybe you weren't able to participate because you were on the phone. So thank you, that's helpful. And it looks like, oh, many people were not at February 23rd. So that's very helpful for Robert to know as he explains the study scope. So thank you, Jasmine. So at this point, we're going to hand it to Robert, who will do an overview of where the study is and next steps. Over to you, Robert.
Great. So hi, I'm Robert Ruggiero. I'm a planner with City Planning Strategies here at the City of Mississauga. So thank you for attending tonight, and thank you for those who attended our previous event in February. You know, the comments and the feedback that we received in February helped launch us to where we are today, and it gave us a strong first step in understanding the community vision. So we're still early on in the process, we're still listening and we're still learning. And after this round of workshop, we plan on drafting policies and releasing that information to the community and getting more feedback before we bring it all together, synthesize the information, synthesize everything we've heard and learned, and bring a report to the Planning and Development Committee. And just as a bit of context, you know, our study area is Lakeshore Road East between Seneca Avenue and Etobicoke Creek, and we're only looking at the properties on Lakeshore Road. Next slide, please. So some of the key messages that we heard from our previous meeting in February, and we've also conducted a survey and other community feedback. So some of the messages that we heard won't be part of our study, but I'll discuss those elements later. Next slide, please. One of the key things that we heard was growth. And so changing growth has been a constant in Lakeview for decades. You know, for example, during the height of the war effort, there were 5,000 workers at the small arms building in the Arsenal lands. So we've seen tremendous change in industry and parkland, all kinds of housing, from mobile homes to trailer parks to cottages and tower apartments. Overall, though, Lakeview's population hasn't changed much for the past 20 years. Right now, our official plan generally allows for 4 stories along the Lakeshore Road corridor. What I wanted to show here is how incremental that growth can be and what it would look like if additional stories were incorporated. Generally, additional stories on top of 4 stories are reduced in size to about half of what they would be on a lower floor, and you can see that in the image. And just to give some perspective, you know, if there's an average of 2 people per unit in a condo or apartment, an additional 2 levels might equal about 20 additional units or approximately 40 additional people. You know, and the taller you go with the angular plane, each level gets smaller. So overall, in our study area, we think there's only about 10 development sites that have 10 sites that have redevelopment potential if we exclude the Rangeview lands, because the Rangeview lands already have a height and density established in the official plan. We're also here to look at a really long horizon. We're talking about like a 30-year horizon. So, you know, change won't happen overnight. And finally, while we acknowledge that growth has been a concern, we only have 1 recently approved rezoning application, which is the Van Dyke site at Dixie and Lakeshore, and we have 3 under review right now. Next slide, please. So this study is focusing on properties on the Lakeshore Road corridor, and we're looking at height, built form, and density. Things that we're not looking at in the study are designs for the road, the parks, the creeks, traffic, or transit. However, although they're outside of the scope of the study, there are other studies happening concurrently that address these issues. And we know that these aspects are a concern for the community, but we want to ensure that these studies are part of a conversation that reinforce each other. But there is a specific gap in our regime or policy regime about the built form on Lakeshore, and that's why we're focusing on that. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, there are other studies that are part of this conversation that are also happening right now. For example, the Major Transit Area Study will help shape growth and how growth occurs along transit, and that's a provincial or regional policy or priority. We also have the Lakeshore Connecting Communities Transportation Master Plan, and that'll provide dedicated bus lanes, express bus service, improved transit, transit stations, cycling, and wider sidewalks. We also have the official plan review, and that's looking how the city should grow overall, how to achieve complete communities. This study, the Lakeshore Corridor study, helps shape the buildings on the corridor and how those buildings can make up a vibrant Main Street. All of these studies are listed on our Your Say website page under related projects. Next slide, please. So we've taken what we heard from February 23rd, and we pulled out the guiding principles, which correlate to what's currently in our official plan and in our Lakeview local area plan. This project is a way to integrate those community concerns with our existing official plan policies. So some of the things that we're looking at are, how a design can enhance a main street and plan for that village Main Street feel. We're looking for a pedestrian environment where we have a complete community where we can walk to all our shops, services, amenities. We're looking to incorporate guidelines which help transition to existing neighborhoods and protect access to light and sky views. And all of these things aren't new. All of these guiding principles aren't new. They're already entrenched in our official plan and our Lakeview local area plan. So this study isn't really about changing the plan as much as it's about building on those plans and making them stronger. Next slide, please. So here's our study area. So the Lakeshore Road East Corridor, you have Seneca on the left side of your screen, and it goes to the Etobicoke Creek on the right side. We're only looking at the properties fronting onto Lakeshore. The big yellow area in the middle on the bottom half of the screen, between East Ave and Applewood Creek, that's the Inspiration Lakeview area, and that area has been incorporated into our official plan, and the framework for how those lands should be developed is already in our official plan. And so that area is not part of our study for height and density, but we could potentially add urban design guidelines to that area. And as a reminder, the official plan for that area in yellow already allows 8 stories for the buildings fronting onto Lakeshore, whereas most of our corridor currently allows 4 stories. So we're planning for that rest of that Lakeshore corridor area. Next slide, please. So for tonight's workshop, we're going to be, as I've just reviewed, key messages and findings from our first meeting, and we've shared some guiding principles, and we're going to see principles of good design and explore models of various sites in the area. But overall, this is an opportunity for you to give feedback on what you hear and see and to give us that feedback. That's really our main goal tonight. And all of these, all the feedback that you provide with us helps develop the guidelines with your input. So we know that growth and change is coming, but this workshop helps manage and influence that growth, and it helps ensure that we get that Main Street that so many of you are looking for. And so I'll hand it over to Harold, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Robert. So I am going to be giving a brief presentation, about 20 minutes. The presentation itself has a lot of material, a lot of images, a lot of supporting information that will be available online for you to download and read at your leisure. So I'll be moving relatively quickly, but don't fret. You can have access to that presentation, and you'll be able to download it, print it, do as you wish with it, and really get to consume it at your own leisure. So I'll give you an overview to kick things off for the purposes of this workshop. Just as a presentation going to be pulled up for me, I believe?
Yes, it's loading now.
Oh, it's loading. Okay. So just a brief introduction to myself. I'm an urban designer and planner. I've been in practice for about 25 years. I was a former director of the city of urban design for the city of Toronto, and I've also held private sector roles in major firms based here, mostly in Toronto. I've worked abroad as well, and much of my focus has been on. You can advance the slides to this is a good section here. Much of my expertise has been in urban regeneration, which is about how existing urban areas adapt and accommodate growth in a way that is well mannered and appropriate. Try to achieve a kind of stability and an enriching environment as things change. Transit-oriented development is also a big focus of my work as well. The next series of slides, if you just advance to the next slide, you'll just see some of my projects key projects, including the recent downtown Toronto plan, Central Waterfront for Toronto, Halifax. Next slide, and a whole series of downtowns and main streets. I just kind of selected projects of experience that are relevant to this project. Next slide, please. Much of my projects have included guidelines as well, so I've become a bit of an expert at guideline writing. I just wanted to touch on, in this presentation, most of my focus will be on what I call 6 key opportunities that this kind of study and this opportunity of the community coming together presents, and 6 key considerations, given my experience and my understanding of this area, what that might be helpful to keep it at the forefront of your minds. So with respect to opportunities, I think it goes without saying, and it's been said already before, and it's part of your principles, that this is really an opportunity to bring to fruition a main street, and all of that meaning. When you talk about Main Street, and in this case it's a village Main Street, what that conjures up in terms of an emotion, an experience, as an opportunity to create physically, but it's also an opportunity to really bring to bear the function of a main street, where the community comes together, the unfolding of street life, all of the mix of uses, and a variety of places to live, all of those things. And this is going to be your very own Main Street, one that's tailored to this community and serving this community. So it's a really great big opportunity that you certainly want to grab hold of. Second, the great thing about a main street nearby is that all your daily needs can happen within a short walk, and this is fundamental to the notion of complete communities and or the 10-15 minute city principles. There's a whole different ways in which these ideas are being packaged, but they all mean the same thing, which is that is this place walkable, and walkable not just in terms of accommodating pedestrians, but actually that you can actually complete your daily needs, most of your daily needs, within a walking distance. Next slide, please. The third one is about this notion of your neighborhood for life. The biggest opportunity that providing a variety of housing types and housing tenures is that it actually can accommodate people through their various life stages. Meaning that if you're an empty nester and your kids have moved out and you want to downsize, you can find a place that is appropriate or suited to your needs within the neighborhood without having to leave the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So that's an important notion of having a neighborhood for being in your neighborhood for life, if you so choose. Fourth, this notion of safe and happy from 8 to 80. If we can design so that an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old feel that they're being served and that they feel safe in the spaces and moving about, then we've really served everyone's interests, because everyone in between those two ages is more able-bodied and certainly would certainly be served by those design considerations. So putting people first, making decision making that is about people and not about cars, for example, becomes an important shift. So that we're focusing on things that are most immediate in terms of impact, from weather protection to safely crossing the street. Next slide, please. The last two are about the opportunity that that investment, in this case, mostly development investment, gives in terms of harnessing or leveraging those opportunities to strategically do things, whether it's revitalize a certain part of the corridor or to repair the errors of the past, to really direct and shift and kind of edge and sculpt and direct that change in such a way that there's an overall improvement to the corridor where it's needed to be improved. And lastly, the opportunity to take those things that mean most to the community in terms of its identity, to reinforce those things, whether it's in the heritage or in the heritage landscape. And that becomes an authentic placemaking opportunity. Next slide, please. With respect to the 6 considerations, and of course, there's many considerations and there's many opportunities, but I'm just going to focus on ones that are most relevant, maybe to this project, and to keep this presentation short. So the first, next slide, please. The first consideration is that this corridor is part of a network of corridors in the city of Mississauga, and Mississauga and most cities that are well planned have an urban structure. There's a hierarchy of uses and functions that is usually transitional, and those places that are corridors, as you can see in the map in the upper left, and in the dotted red is the Lakeshore East Corridor study area. That's where it fits in the overall kind of overall structure that's specific and tailored to Mississauga. You have a series of centers, one including the Inspiration Lakeview, which you're adjacent to. These are where it fits in terms of the hierarchy. It relates to its context and its relationship to other important destinations, and this helps to determine things like height and the intensity of uses and other functions, civic functions, for example, that might be located here to serve the community that surrounds the corridor. Next slide, please. Second consideration is about identifying and building on the local distinctions and strengths. And you can see in this series of photos, things that I picked up in my tour of the area that stood out as either unique or having some prominence, or something that I think had opportunity to build on. And they become things that are landmarks or that help to define what it is that makes this place what it is, so that it actually has it actually feels like somewhere. And so heritage, cultural landscapes, streetscapes, gateways, landmarks, all of those things become important things that we want to identify early on. Next slide. When we talk about the built form and the design of the built form and the important things to be thinking about, we can think of it in 3 scales. I know this was already touched on, but this is just kind of drilling down to a little bit more detail. The first scale is about the pedestrian experience and what would happen at the eye level, and it's a pretty defined area that includes the sidewalk and the first 2 stories, 2 to 3 stories of the building. Most importantly, the first story of that building, of course, ensuring that you're creating a safe, animated, and visually interesting environment that is scaled to the pedestrian, and that so that you have a great deal of variety at intervals that are scaled relatively tight and more like a main street where you have shops, for example, that are that are typically 15 up to 15 meters wide, but not much wider than that, or at least the articulation architecturally for that. But other things that come along with that are weather protection, awnings, and signage, and seating, and other things that will help to support a pedestrian culture here. And those are the things that happen at that level. Also, the other important thing is that the quality of materials and the thoughtfulness around workmanship become very important, because they're so that part of the building is so present and tangible, and is there for people to touch and see. Next one is thinking about the quality of the street wall. If you pull out from the sidewalk, if you pull out from the sidewalk and look at the next scale, it would be the street wall, that part of the building that is most prominent and fronting and framing the street. And that is often in an area which calls itself, for example, a village. Typically, you'd see about a 3 to 4 story street wall height, and that becomes the kind of the important part of the experience of the street as you move along, and the facade, and how if there are any projections, the facade treatment and design, what material that is, becomes very important. And they're usually establishing a consistent cornice line that is legible from the pedestrian level becomes important as well. The next scale, next slide. The next scale is thinking about the street, the urban room, we call it, where you see the street in its full voluminous experience, where the maximum height of the building. So you might have a street wall height, but you might have step backs that might actually take you to the rest of the building that might rise up further up several stories, and that the maximum height or ultimate height and where those are located relative to the building wall establish things like the urban room's lip, and where, for example, sun access and shadowing are affected often happen at the top of the urban room. And so the upper levels of the building, where they're positioned, whether they step back or not, all of those become very important considerations for sky view, transition, and shadowing, for example, and how we, for example, deal with mechanical penthouses, and so that they're out of view or out of sight. So that becomes the urban room, and it's really important to think about the corridor in that sense, so that we don't have gaps in that room, and so that it feels like a contiguous, complete experience. Lastly, one thing that we often forget is all the stuff that comes with mixed use, which is somewhat messy: garbage pickup, loading, parking. All of those things have to go somewhere, because this area isn't benefiting from a rear lane network, which often help with these intensifying areas. It's something that we'll have to think about on a site-by-site basis in many cases. Those things become important considerations as well that we can't forget. Next slide, please. Just to tie up the presentation, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to give you some case studies that might be worthwhile to look at. There's two. The first, next slide, is the City of Toronto's performance standards for mid-rise buildings. There's been a lot of effort that was put into this exercise. Next slide, please. That the city undertook, anticipating intensification along its corridors years ago. This is in 2010 that this study was completed. When I was Director of Urban Design, we actually did a review and monitoring, so to speak, of how mid-rise was unfolding on the corridors in Toronto, and we further refined the standards or guidelines for mid-rise. So a lot of thought has been put into this, and we don't need to be reinventing the wheel. And some of the things that it looked at, if you can go to the next slide, that are key standards that are being used over and over again and in many cities, because this is an award-winning document. This looks at 3 scales in the same way that I presented it, except they just have different names for them. Next slide, please. But some of the key standards include, there's 36 of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it would be good for you to have a look at them if you really, really want to dig deep into built form standards. Next slide. About the notion of height not being taller than the width of the right of way, and that's the full maximum height, not just the street wall height. Next slide. which is a one-to-one relationship, standard that's been used in many cities, especially in Europe, that upper level step backs happen at a 45-degree angle. And that is also to ensure that you have sky view and sun access to the sidewalks across the street. Next slide. That, you know, shallow lots and deep lots may have different standards for transition. Next slide. And, you know, how all of this comes together, you know, illustrated in a very easy to understand way is also a very important part of the guidelines. And this kind of pulls it all together into one illustration. Next slide, please. Another thing that's important to consider is that some things that are guidelines might become really good opportunities to amend the zoning bylaw because they are measurable, quantifiable, and they are very important to hold the line, for example, such as height, ground floor height, ground floor height as well. You know, so that you don't have these underwhelming grade level conditions, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. This just goes through a series of slides showing, you know, an example of how transformation might occur on the corridors in which are called avenues in Toronto. This is this is what it would look like today. Next slide shows the beginning, the introduce mid-rise buildings, and then lastly the introduction of a fully built out mid-rise environment, Main Street environment that's vibrant and has storefronts and people living and working above. Next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but just to at least introduce it and allow you the opportunity to see it on your own time, and we can just move through the slides as I'm talking. You can just advance it. But Centre Street in Vaughan is a typical contemporary part of the city that was built in mostly in the 80s and 90s. That is now going through its pressures for intensification and development because of the introduction of a BRT in the same way that's happening in Lakeshore in this study. There were two significant sites, a shallow and a deep site, which we call Site 1 and Site 2, and you can advance the slides as I'm talking, that were looking for guidance and standards in terms of how to develop. And so I was part of a study that undertook a master planning exercise, and that led to an urban design framework. This is the urban structure of the city and the region in which this has to fit. The interesting thing about this place that is somewhat similar to Lakeshore is that it is somewhat single-sided, at least for the entirety of this study area. But in the same way that Lakeshore has this interesting single-loaded condition where you have a different southern side for a good part of the eastern portion of it. You can keep advancing the slides, and I'll just talk about how we took urban design kind of framework and translated that into guidelines, and that eventually led to envelopes for built form that resulted that tried to meet certain objectives such as transition, such as maintaining a low-rise human scaled street wall along Centre Street, and that tried to direct taller buildings more towards the center of the deeper site. And I'll leave it at that. But you can move as you advance through the slides. You can just see some of the kind of the work that went into establishing guidelines and standards for built form to make sure that there was a fit with what is predominantly an established 2.5-story residential neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Harold. So I'm going to introduce some of the discussion points before we go into our breakout rooms. So Jasmine's going to help pull up the slide for the breakout rooms, and I'm going to give a bit of information. So when we go into our breakout rooms, we're going to be prepared to tackle our objectives and our exercise today. And I'll just start discussing a little bit of it. I can highlight and I'll highlight some of the urban design principles that we're going to be looking at in our breakout rooms. And those principles will help us achieve this complete community, vibrant Main Street. And so I want us to keep in mind how the sidewalk feels when we're walking on Lakeshore, when we're walking down the street. How does it make you feel now? How does it make you feel, or how could it make you feel? How could we improve this feeling? That's perfect. So some of the things that we're looking at, and this image is just a concept. It's just an idea at this point. And as Harold mentioned, it's just like a building envelope as well. And so we're just looking at something that we could, place a building into this shape. So we do have some policies about 45-degree angular plane and transition in our official plan right now, but we're looking to refine that and potentially incorporate other features. And this first principle is the front setback, and so it's at the front of the building. And it provides us an opportunity to plant a street tree. It gives us space for some street furniture. It gives us space for patios. It gives us an engaging storefront. Next slide, please. We're touching upon some of the same elements that Harold mentioned as well, but some of these other urban design principles are a street wall. In this case, it's a 4-story street wall, so you can see the 4 different levels. And after that 4th story, we have a step back at the 4th level. And you can see how the upper floors are pushed back from the street. Having a street wall like this is something that makes the street a comfortable place to walk, and it gives us a sense of enclosure. These buildings kind of hug the street a little bit. And the step back at the higher floors pushes the building away, pushes the massing away, so there's a bit more space for the street. It breaks up the wall, gives you a space for a terrace or something. Next slide, please. So this next piece that we could influence is a rear landscape buffer, and so it helps kind of mitigate some of those impacts that are on adjacent properties. Again, this kind of setback, this kind of rear landscape buffer, it's a place or opportunity where we could plant landscaping or trees or bushes, a place to walk your dog perhaps. It provides you some separation between this building and the neighbors, gives you a bit of privacy. Next slide, please. The 45-degree angular plane helps push the building away from the rear property line, ensuring you have sunlight and daylight and privacy on the adjacent lands. It helps with overlook condition, so you have privacy on that neighboring property. It also sculpts the building envelope, so that reduces the space and the size of the floor on the upper floors. But it's also not supposed to be so rigid like this. This is just a guideline for buildings to fit into this shape. And so these are like the envelope of what could fit. Next slide, please. And it brings us to our last item in urban design principles, which is height. And it's just one of the constraints, one of the parameters that we're looking at. Something like the 45-degree angular plane might have more of an impact than just height alone. So height is usually compared with the width of the road or the width of the right-of-way. So on wider roads, you'd often find taller buildings. Next slide, please. So if those previous images was the concept, here's a real life version of that kind of concept. So at the front, you can see that there's a bit of a setback, and there's space for a bit of landscaping and a street tree, or it might provide space for a patio or some other kind of animated storefront. Next slide, please. So the street wall and the step back, you can see how it's 4 stories here, and then at the 4th story, they've pushed it back. Again, it provides a comfortable place to walk on the street. It gives you some interest when you're walking on the street. This is where you'd have your storefronts and the most interesting part of the building usually. And the step back is on the higher floor, and that gives you, again, a space for terrace. It just breaks up that wall. Next slide, please. So that rear landscape buffer, it gives you a space for a tree or some landscaping, gives you that separation between this building and the neighbor. Next slide, please. So here you can see they've really taken the 45-degree angular plane and that envelope, and they've really built it out. Sometimes it's not always so exact like this, but you can see how the higher floors are pushed away from the neighbor, and it ensures that you have sunlight and daylight on the neighboring property, and it helps transition from a taller building to a lower building. Next slide, please. Again, overall, the height shown here, it's just one ingredient in a recipe. So all these things together are what we're looking for feedback, the things that we can influence and change in going forward, and we can discuss in our breakout rooms. Next slide, please. So when developing the models, the urban designers have to start somewhere. They have to start essentially with a box, and then they take the elements that we've just discussed, and they start cutting away with those tools that we just reviewed. In this case, Lakeshore would be, like a theoretical Lakeshore would be on the left-hand side, and the residential street would be on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. They've implemented a front setback at the front, and they've implemented a rear setback as well. You can see that in green. Again, that could be a wider sidewalk, or that could be space for a street tree. Next slide, please. So next, the urban designers introduced a step back. That's this area in pink. It steps back after the 4th story. And that front part of the building facing onto that main street would be that street wall, the most important side and facade of the building. Next slide, please. Finally, the urban designers introduced that 45-degree angular plane, which is in yellow. So that line, that plane, pushes the rear of the building away from the adjacent residential. And in this case, it pushes almost the whole building, just the way that 45-degree angular plane works, not just the upper floors. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the last slide before we go on to our breakout rooms. So we have looked at 3 different models, concepts, examples, based on 3 different real-life sites in Lakeview. So the first site is our small example, our small site example, which is at the northwest corner of Lakeshore and Westmount. The second example is at the northwest corner of Lakeshore and Cawthra, and that's our medium-sized site. And our third example is at the southeast corner of Lakeshore and East. And the way we've broken these down is on size and on depth. So our small site is smaller than 40 meters in depth. Our medium site are those greater than 40 meters in depth. And then our large site are these sites in range view, which I mentioned earlier, has a different height regime, a different height permission. And those lots are really deep. So the range view lots are approximately 85 meters in depth. And as a reminder, the range view lands permit up to 8 stories fronting onto Lakeshore. The reason why we split small and medium as to less than 40 and greater than 40 is because you need about 40 meters to do underground parking. And that's going to be a key consideration as to how tall buildings can be in this exercise. Now remember, we're going to go into our breakout rooms in a minute, and we want to focus on height, on street wall, on step backs, on setbacks, on the angular plane, and the rear landscaping. And then for that range view example, we're looking for the street wall, for step backs, and for setbacks. And that's it for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert, for the explanation. And thank you, Harold. So Jasmine has set up 2 breakout rooms, and you will see a prompt that will pop up in the middle of your screen. Please accept, and you'll be welcomed into the room with a facilitator. For those of you who are not on WebEx and who have called in using your phone, you'll be with me in the main room so we can have a conversation there. We will try we'll work with 50 minutes as a minimum in the breakout room. If we have longer, we'll let you know, but we'll start with 50 minutes. And we look forward to hearing from you. Please do help us. Please tell us what you're thinking. So over to Jasmine to set up the breakout rooms. And while she's doing that, Within each breakout room, if each group could identify somebody who could report back to the larger group at the end, we would appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll see you in a little while.